why should people believe that stress is actually good for them?
Yeah, well, stress needs a new PR agent. Well, listen, the stress that most of us experience as part of our quotidian life, is patently bad stress, and I'm talking about stress that is chronic and is related to essentially how we experience life, which is oftentimes with, bulging calendars and too much work and too much social media and too much 24-hour news. Essentially, the world, which conspires around this concept of the attention economy where, basically your focus and attention has been commodified. The incentives are not good there. Essentially, we have so many blips and dings in our life vying for our attention. And often in order to get it, they leverage human negativity bias, right? So outrage and fear, and put us in this state of constant fight or flight, which was good, on the Serengeti, not great on the Serengeti of Facebook or Twitter. And so most of us spend our lives these days in this constant sort of cortisol-infused bad stress state. But stress was actually, from a Paleolithic perspective, really adaptive. It conferred a tremendous amount of benefit, as we evolved. And of course, we evolved in relation to our environment. And so, what I've tried to do is reframe stress under the rubric of good stress. And, in the context of my work and my book, these are amalgam of protocols that I reified in my own life to completely transform my health. But really what they do is they mimic the Paleolithic conditions in which we evolved, right? So a degree of food scarcity, a degree of exposure to fluctuations in temperature, face-to-face communication. That's the only way we used to be able to communicate, right? We were immersed in nature. We wore minimal clothes and minimal shoes, all these things that seem stressful today actually, thousands of years ago, conferred a great benefit. And many of these protocols are built on the shoulders of this concept of hormesis, which I know that you address on your show, which really is a psychological or physiological benefit in relation to short-term acute stress. And many people understand it just kind of through the Nietzsche quote of, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? And so, what I started to do in my own life as I was trying to cure myself from obesity and diabetes and high inflammation, was to look around and try to understand the etiology of my own disease and by extension, the provenance of so many, chronic diseases in the world. And, what I realized is that, chronic disease is largely the result of chronic ease. We've engineered our lives over the last 150 years, but particularly over the last 50 to 70 years for so much comfort and convenience. And that's led candidly to a lot of discomfort and a lot of inconvenience. So now we actually have to self-impose what I call good stress into our lives, self-impose some of these deliberate acute protocols to realign ourselves with our own engineering, with our own biology. And some of these are well known. So fasting protocols and, cold and heat therapy and light therapy, et cetera. And then some of them are more bespoke and esoteric, like the art of having stressful conversations and social fitness, to address things like loneliness and polarization.
What do you think helps build more resilience in people? Is it some of the protocols that you write about in the book and that we've all grown to like and know, or is it people's ability to survive stressful situations in the moment?
We are engineered to have adaptive response to short-term stress. And we see it all the time, whether we notice it or not. So, the most obvious one, right, is like you overload a muscle and, what happens to that muscle? The microfibers tear and then you give it some rest and enough leucine or some protein, and what happens? Like it grows back bigger. But there's other adaptive responses all the time. You go to high altitudes, for example, and the air is less dense, and by extension, the pressure of oxygen is less and creates less diffusion in your lungs, so you get less oxygen in your bloodstream and then to your cells for energy production. And what happens? Your body has an adaptive response to that stress, to that mild hypoxia, and creates a protein called EPO, which then creates more red blood cells, which then, is the couriers for oxygen to your cells, and you make better energy and your mitochondria actually upgrade. So we have this incredible engineering that in the face of stress, we adapt. And through that adaptation, we become more resilient. So we don't even really have to think about it. I mean, many times our body is actually just wired for it. But most of the time in modern life, we're not putting ourselves in any sorts of situations of stress. We're in this kind of temperature neutrality, always 72 degrees, lying on the couch, watching Netflix, eating a pint of Chubby Hubby kind of reality. And that has very, very negative knock-on impacts.
I'd love to get into some of these protocols you talk about in the book, and especially the ones that are accessible for all. Sometimes people will see things like red light therapy. They'll see things like sauna, ice bath, and you know what? I don't have a pool. I'm not jumping in the river. I'm not spending 10 grand on an ice bath. I have nowhere to put an ice bath. I'm not buying a sauna. Just give me the basics. So what have you found to be the most accessible forms of healthy stress modalities, I guess, if you will, that return the most on the investment?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, just to address your point here is that, yeah, you're right. A lot of these wellness kind of quote unquote trends have been cubbyholed for the affluent or the effete and not accessible. But I really try to focus on the things that are honestly free or can kind of save you money in many cases, with the asterisk being healthy, whole, regeneratively grown, organic farmers market food, right? So that, unfortunately, the way that we've set up our food system, those do tend to be relatively expensive. But my line there is you can pay the farmer or you can pay the pharmacist, right? So I'd rather pay the farmer and go out of pocket there than be on insulin for the rest of my life. But the other protocols are really pretty much accessible to anyone. I mean, fasting will save you money, arguably, because you're consolidating your consumption of food in an 8-hour window. And all you're really, that's my fasting protocol is 16-8. Obviously, there's other 24-hour fasts and every other day fasts and things like that. Mine is very simple. I'm just kind of a 16-8 guy, consolidate all my consumption of food in 8 hours. I'm not a fundamentalist neurotic about it either, but I try to operate with that protocol because really in our day and age, abundance is no longer balanced by scarcity. But if you look at how we evolved, we had to endure periods of food scarcity all the time, and calorie paucity, as you well know, can not only obviously keep you lean, but it also activates all of these other physiological pathways, AMPK and autophagy and, mitobiogenesis and all these other pathways in the human body that were engineered around scarcity. And so I think this is a practice that I think everyone should experiment with, if not only for the physiological impacts of it, but also for the psychological impacts of it. And candidly, that's where I found, a lot of people associate fasting with all of the physical benefits, but I found that the most potent impact of fasting was psychological for me, because even if I only ate between 11 and 7, for example, it didn't mean I didn't get hungry at 9:30, right? And so, but as I became sort of a disciple, right, to this practice, instead of mindlessly migrating over to the refrigerator and just, grabbing the first thing in sight, I actually had to witness the nature of the hunger itself and kind of untangle whether or not the provenance of that hunger was a biological need. Did I really need this food to exist? Or was it an emotional or psychological desire? Was I bored? Or did someone insult me? Or was I eating my feelings? And almost every single time it was the latter. Almost every time I was hungry at 9:30, I was just eating out of habit or boredom or frustration or whatever. And the fact that we have this endless surfeit of calories now in our I'm not trying to say that there's no food scarcity anywhere, but most Westerners, there's just on your phone, you can just tap it up and get like Chick-fil-A and by the end of this podcast or whatever. The issue there is that because we have so many ultra processed calories, that we can assuage our psychological woes with calories now to give us that sort of burst of dopamine and satisfy ourselves in the short term. But when you have a fasting protocol, you just don't do that anymore. And what you have to do is actually examine the stimulus, which is the hunger, and then the response, which is either I'm going to go to the refrigerator or no, I'm good right now. I'm cool. And, when you have to do that, you find that space, that famous Viktor Frankl space, right? Between stimulus and response. And in that space, there's a choice. And in that choice is your liberation and freedom. And so what I found was that space that I was able to cultivate in my fasting protocol started to bleed into the rest of my life and punctuate other areas of my life. Like, did I also need that glass of wine? Well, probably not. Did I need to make that transaction on Amazon? Probably not. Like, did I need that Instagram boost? How was I going to respond when my children did something inevitably incredibly annoying? Was I going to just have a knee-jerk response, or was I going to actually find that space and say, I wonder what the origin of that behavior was and what is the proper response as a parent to shepherd my child in this moment? And so this is why I think that these protocols, cold water therapy is very similar in that respect too, but this is why I think these protocols, they're great for your physical body, but in many cases, they're even more potent for your psychological life.
Yeah, and I guess what you're getting at is for people to get better at managing stress, they have to get better at delaying gratification, right? And you're talking about people when they're stressed out, they sometimes go for the processed food. When they're stressed out, they make an expensive purchase they might not, want to make. When they're stressed out, they may act a certain way towards their kids or whatever the example is. And I think that's why it's so important to have these protocols or things you practice, whether it's something like fasting where you're delaying the gratification of food, whether it's something like exercise where you know that if you go to the gym just one day, you're probably not going to see results. If you go to the gym 2 days, you're probably not going to see results. You have to go to the gym for weeks and months and years to like really get to a place where you can look in the mirror and say, wow, like I have definitely changed myself. And you can use that example with other things. So like, what are some of the things that, because I think that, developing a protocol around an eating window, I think can be very effective for people, including the psychological benefits. But I think to the novice person, it's not going to stop them immediately from these psychological triggers that might happen when they're stressed. That may lead to them reaching for, a Snickers bar or what have you. Anything that's worked for you as you've been on your health journey that have helped you delay gratification and reduce stress like instantly in the moment?
Yeah. Well, I think what you're kind of poking at is tools for emotional regulation, because life will be inevitably stressful. Stressful moments will arise. And then how quickly can you bounce back to center? That's the question. Health in every expression is always reflected by balance. You can look at, ecology, politics, economy, whatever. It's always balance that is the signature of health. And that is certainly true in the human body. We call that homeostasis. And the body, again, is wired for homeostasis, pH balance, neurotransmitter balance, hormonal balance, blood glucose balance, temperature regulation, all of these. The body is so incredible at finding the Goldilocks zone all the time. But we seem to be less able to find the Goldilocks zone around stress. And so what are the tools that allow us to experience some degree of stress and then move back to emotional homeostasis so we can leverage this neo-mammalian brain and make good decisions and be nice people? And, you think about like, I'm a hiker, so I'm up in the trails around here. Every dozen times that I hike or something, I'll run into like a coyote or a rattlesnake or something that will trigger a stress response, a very, very adaptive stress response that serves my biological imperative to exist, right? So we all know that response, our heart rate and respiratory rate increase, glucose like goes to our extremities, and our pupils dilate, our aperture of attention becomes very narrow, we become very self-obsessed and distrust the world. And then the snake slithers off, or the coyote moves off into the underbrush. And what happens? In a couple minutes, heart rate and respiratory decrease, and our aperture opens up again, and we relax, we move back into our parasympathetic nervous system. We bounce back, right? We have a natural, emotionally regulated response. But in so much of modern life, candidly, like that coyote never leaves. The snake never leaves the path. And so we find ourselves again in this chronically elevated stress state. So this is why these tools of top-down conscious pressure on top of involuntary bottom-up response are so powerful, particularly talking about the use of the breath or meditation, even contemplation, any form of mind training that essentially allows us to put top-down pressure, hippocampal pressure, on top of sort of neuroendocrine involuntary response. So, like, for example, you can mimic that. Like when you get into like a cold shower, and yeah, you don't need a $5,000 or $10,000 fancy cold plunge. You just turn the water on cold. Pretty much everyone can do that. Or if people have a tub and fill it with cold water and put some ice in it or whatever. And what happens when you get in? Very, very similar physical response as when you see the coyote or the snake. It's right. You have a bottom up involuntary response, and you go, and epinephrine courses through your veins, and you feel a sense of panic. And then there is a moment there where you can apply some sort of conscious behavior on top of unconscious involuntary response. So maybe you engage in some sort of parasympathetic oriented breath work, like just a deep breath, or, if you have a meditation practice, you can focus on the sensation and know that this is just another phenomenon arising in consciousness, and it will subside in consciousness, and that is it. Or you can apply your neo-mammalian brain and know rationally that you are going to be okay, and these are the practices that you train yourself in, such that when a stressful situation does arise, when someone cuts you off in traffic, when you're in a very, very stressful conversation with someone that doesn't agree with you, or worse, that you then have that capacity to apply conscious pressure on top of involuntary response. And, that so much of life is that. It's just mindset. Every single perception we have of the world around us filters through our mind. And so we need to train it the same way we train the biceps.
For sure. You got to train the biceps too, though.
Yes. Well, they're actually interrelated, candidly. So, yeah.
I know one of the things you talk a lot about is the importance of having tough conversations and kind of sharing some tips on how to do so. And I think that, it's been pretty well known now at this point that in order for relationships, whether it's personal or professional, to improve, like you have to have the hard conversations, whether they're big or small, and they end up either transforming the relationship one way or the other. But regardless, you feel better because you're like, like I have confidence in the peace, knowing that I stood up for myself, or that I didn't let something fester for too long, or whatever the case may be. Talk about your experience with hard conversations, and what are some of the techniques that you've used to make tough conversations to your benefit?
So this was not anything I was looking for necessarily, but I'll just give you a little bit of context in terms of how I began to excavate this area of good stress. So in 2020, March, where we kind of anchored into port lockdown there for COVID, I started writing a weekly column or newsletter for Commune, which is my media business. And there was a lot of people on that list, like north of 1 million people. And I was writing about COVID. You know, it was 2020. So there was plenty of fodder there, you know, politically and otherwise. It was the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent reckoning for social justice. There was obviously COVID, the sort of early emergence of the vaccine. There was obviously the election, right? And, you know, the rise of QAnon. There was so many things to write about, very controversial topics. And, you know, I was just trying to write a very kind of rigorously researched newsletter with the idea that, you know, if you share ideas, you know, you can make people feel less alone. And this was a moment in time where people had a lot of fear, and a lot of that fear was connected to aloneness and being sheltered in place. And so I went into it with the best intentions. Of course, this was a moment where people were highly triggerable. So, you know, over the course of 2,000 words, I was apt to, you know, offend someone with some turn of phrase or some idea. And I connected my personal email to these missives. And so, yeah, Monday morning, I would just get this massive deluge of emails cresting the bow of my inbox. And many of them were very encouraging and kind, but I would probably get 50 to 100 really critical emails a week. And, you know, I was always like a people pleaser growing up, and I always really judged myself through the eyes of others. So at first I would get this opprobrium and I would be very, very defensive. And, you know, I would brood over it at night. I would be formulating these clever rejoinders. You know, of course, you're holding that ember, and all that time you're the one getting burned. So eventually, similarly to how people build their physiological immune system, which is sort of low-grade exposure to pathogens, viruses, and bacteria, and then you spin up these proteins, these antibodies that can neuter those things. I kind of did that with my psychological immune system. You know, through exposure to insult, I eventually became immune to it. And I actually started to look forward to it as an opportunity to engage with people that didn't agree with me. And at this juncture, I didn't have a lot of training in nonviolent communication. And subsequently, I discovered all these different techniques around this kind of stuff. But I started asking my detractors if they would join me on a Zoom call. And these were people from all over the political spectrum. They were like, you know, full on abolish the police on the left, and it was full on Trumpers on the right. And I was everyone coming at me from all different angles. And so it wasn't just like, you know, one type of person that didn't like me. And so in August and September 2020, I had about 26 hour-long Zoom calls with people that disagreed with me or didn't like me. And it was a trip. And I learned a tremendous amount during that experience on how to lean in to stressful conversations. And I started to build up techniques and protocols to really find a lot of common ground with people that really don't share my values or just didn't like me for one reason or another. And during that time, I will also say that just giving people the platform to be seen and heard was a service. I didn't even really realize that, but a lot of these people just wanted someone to talk to. So I was sort of free therapy. But yeah, I started to get really good at, like, you know, there's some precepts, you know, one is which is like listening, real active listening, you know, listening to understand and not listening to respond is how I think about it. And, you know, so much of the time when we're in conversation with someone, they're still talking and we're already formulating our response or our rebuttal. And some of that is just natural. It's cool. I'm doing it right. You're probably doing it right now. It's fine, you know. But I think when you're in a stressful conversation where there's real like moral values at stake, there is inestimable value of just listening, not to respond, not to formulate any rebuttal, but just active listening. And then once the person is finished talking, have a pause where you synthesize everything that they've said and then formulate your response. It is such a more adaptive way of having a conversation. Not only is it better for you, but the person that you're talking to feels actually seen, and heard. So that was one of the main precepts that I learned, was just like active listening. And then the other one that I found to be incredibly effective was not trying to seek agreement or solution, but actually just seeking connection. And, as I listened actively to many of my detractors, I would take little notes of, oh yeah, I also have daughters, areas of convergence. I was also born in Chicago or whatever. And then instead of, rebutting, their point, I would actually first note the areas that we shared some sort of commonality. And it immediately just popped the balloon of outrage. And it was like incredibly humanizing. So these were a couple of the techniques, that I used as I kind of built up my arsenal for having these conversations. And a lot of it is also creating the right set and setting for people. People, if you're going into a conversation in a fight or flight kind of mentality, it's not going to be a profitable result. But if you go in and you create a set and setting of safety and security and serenity and calmness, there's much greater chance that, you're going to find some connection with people. And yeah, I developed, this group of 24 frenemies kind of at the end of it, where, we would text back and forth and we still didn't agree on plenty of things, but we found a level of sort of common connection that transcended some sort of the petty arguments that we would have around the best policy for immigration, or, was COVID more rampant amongst people that had diabetes or whatever, whatever the source of the original issue was. So, and then I started to apply that to a whole bunch of different situations. Last August, I hosted a retreat between 8 Palestinians and 8 Israelis. That was interesting. We have a retreat center as part of my media business called Commune. So we have a 10-acre property up in Topanga where we host all sorts of different retreats, mostly wellness-oriented retreats, a little bit of plant medicine here and there. But I use it for other kinds of purposes like masterminds. And in this case, for a summit around the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and brought a bunch of student leaders from both sides to the property for 5 days and engaged in this really, really deep listening work. And what came out of the other side was just unbelievable. I mean, these people that were baked in completely polarized political identities by the end were drafting peace agreements. I mean, it was quite amazing what happens when you engage in this kind of work. And, more recently, I did it at a big conference right before the election, where I got a Trump supporter and a Kamala Harris supporter on stage and got them to look in each other's eyes and tell each other's narratives. And by the end, they didn't agree, but they gave each other a big hug and they saw, some humanity in each other. And so this is the benefits of having stressful conversations are so profound and multifarious, and we almost always avoid them. You know what I mean? We almost always avoid these conversations, but there's so much on the other side of them. And of course, if we can engage in these stressful conversations with people that we don't know, think of how useful that could be with the people, that we love and care about most in the world. Our parents, my parents are getting older. I want to have the hard conversations with them before I can't do it anymore. And so I think, it is really beneficial to lean in on some of these things.
Yeah, there's so many things we could talk about from that. First, that's awesome what you did and how you used your transformative experience with your own discourse with people, right? To use that to create massive impact with issues that are incredibly divisive. And it's really cool that people found some level of common ground despite their massive, disagreements, based on their values and beliefs and policies and stuff. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the difference between relationships and what you just talked about and diet and exercise when it comes to living a better life, a less stressful life. Because there's like that research study out of Harvard that I think they tracked 8 decades of people, and I'm sure you might be familiar with this. You may have had the same.
Robert Waldinger, I think. Yeah.
And they say like the people who are happiest, it's been studied by research, it's like the ones who have the deepest like relationships with like specifically like life partner, spouse, you know what I mean? Like somebody that they're married to. But then I think underneath of that, it's like friendships. And so it's interesting to me that there's so much content online about changing your health and diet, which I think is incredibly important. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. There's just not as much emphasis on like, how do you like transform like your relationships, and not like attracting the right partner. I mean, like, how do you do things like we're talking about, have these hard conversations? And so with that said, like, have you found it more valuable for yourself and your ability to manage your own mental health and stress to get better at having hard conversations and deepening the relationships with, you know, people in your family, your close friends, or are things like the cold plunge, sauna, you know, eating less ultra processed foods, are they more beneficial for reducing overall stress?
Yeah, I think they're very, very related, candidly. It's hard to pull them apart. I know that my ice plunge protocol is incredibly useful in my social life because it's a very similar, that sympathetic or amygdala overload, that activation is very similar in a stressful conversation as it is in an ice bath. I do think it's fascinating, and I think you're referring to this. I can't remember exactly the name of the study, but it was the biggest longitudinal study ever conducted.
I think it's the adult development study. I think
that's correct. Yeah. And the director is a guy, he's actually also a Roshi, a Zen monk, but his name is Robert Waldinger. And coincidentally, my wife's grandfather was one of the subjects of the study. So that study started in 1938, and I believe they took 238 or 240 Harvard sophomores and followed them throughout their entire life. And they would, I remember him getting these questionnaires, very, very in-depth questionnaires every couple of years that he would fill out. I interviewed Bob Waldinger on the podcast, and I asked him that. I was like, hey, what was the number one determinant of self-reported happiness and well-being? And without hesitation, he said the depth of one's social connections, period. It transcended wealth. It even in some ways, I think, transcended elements of health, which I found to be kind of surprising because candidly, I conflate happiness and health in my life quite a bit. So, yeah, I mean, then of course, I think these studies on human loneliness have, bubbled up to the surface. I'm sure you've seen some of these. There was one that came out of BYU, which, claimed that loneliness was a greater contributor to all-cause mortality than smoking 15 cigarettes per day or being an alcoholic.
Yeah, I heard about that.
So, and of course, more people live alone in our country than in any time in history. And so, this is a huge, huge issue. I mean, I interviewed this trauma expert named Gabor Mate.
He's been on the show a few times. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. I mean, he said this to me. It's like, if you mapped the entirety of human history across the course of a day, we lived communally for 23 hours and 54 minutes of it. So this idea of living in, a single family home, or a vertical box, in a gated community, this is a very, very recent phenomenon. And we're really just simply not wired to live alone. We are wired to live in community. And that is how we lived for tens of thousands of years. And so this idea of the erosion of social connections is something that is quite new to our species. And I think we're just getting, our hands around it. I know in my personal life, my connections, both professionally and personally, are probably at the very, very top of my list. And so I feel like in this day and age, you actually need a social fitness protocol to sit right aside your physical fitness protocol, because so much of life is geared towards individualism, and loneliness. I mean, we sanctify the individual. All our big American heroes are the captains of industry, or literally superheroes that we see on the screen. It's like the Elon Musks and, the Mark Zuckerbergs or the Jeff Bezoses and whatever, or the LeBron Jameses, the athletes, etc. And most of us sit behind digital screens all day, sort of communicating somewhat anonymously. So, we need to actually now make real effort to have face-to-face in real life communication and build those kinds of bonds. I mean, there's this whole emerging field of study, and probably heard about it, but Mark Hyman talks a lot about it. It's called sociogenomics, is that our genes actually change their expression. They turn on and off in relationship to our social conditions. So just like being here, even though we're talking virtually, but I'm super locked in on you, Doug, and it's actually having an effect on the expression of my genes moment to moment. And that is pretty powerful. And, so there's no wonder that you start to see the loneliness being associated with these cresting rates of suicide and drug use, right? And then those things are sort of bi-directional, because the more drugs that you end up doing, the more alone that you get, so they sort of reinforce. They're both a cause and an effect of each other. And so this is a massive issue of like, how do we rebuild forums for real community connection and lean in and build greater social connection? And then, the other component of it, which is actually kind of ironic, is that while most of us live alone, or that we're suffering from a lot of loneliness, we're not comfortable with that aloneness. And so, that's the flip side of it, is that oftentimes chosen solitude can be really, really important at feeling connected. And so, I'm a bit of an introvert, but in moments of like meditation, for example, I can foster a sense of great connectivity. And so it's both. It's being able to develop ourselves as ambiverts, I call them, where you feel really, really comfortable and satisfied by your social connections, but you also feel totally okay in your own chosen solitude. But again, these are areas of our life that we seldom work on, but they really do need attention.
I love the concept of social fitness, and you're right. Like, there's a difference between combating loneliness and not being okay being by yourself. And so I'm interested to hear, like, what is your process for this? Like, what's your routine look like, or your advice for someone that's listening to this? Like, you know what? Like, I have noticed that I've been isolating myself a bit much. I'm spending a lot of time by myself. I don't have anybody in my life, and I'm trying to also put myself out there. Maybe they're trying to meet somebody, romantically. They're trying to make new friends, but they also don't want to get down that slippery slope of just going out and hanging out with people for the sake of not being alone. How do they do that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of techniques that I would suggest, but I'll just give you a couple. One is service can be really powerful, like some form of philanthropic work in your life, like where you go out and you're providing assistance or a service to someone or some organization. It creates an unbelievable sense of gratitude and connectivity. You're often meeting people that you wouldn't otherwise meet. And from a neuromodulator perspective, it flushes you with dopamine and serotonin. So work in some element of service into your life. So unbelievably important. The other ones are like, just take 5 minutes every day to reach out to a friend or family member. Sounds so simple, but how often do we really do that? Just 5 minutes every day. You can even set it on your phone to do it. Just reach out and let someone know that you're there for them. I mean, period. The other thing that I've started to do is I always pick up my phone when a good friend or a family member calls me, instead of, engaging in some sort of endless text thread about how I'm not available. Even if I can't talk in that moment, I will pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I see that you're calling me. I love you, but I can't talk, but I'll call you back later." Just little things like that in your life. Random acts of kindness. A smile with someone on the street, or just a small act of giving, giving someone a little bit of an extra tip or something like that. These kinds of things can go so far in feeling a sense of greater connection to the world around you. So those are ways, I think, that a few very, very simple ways that I think people can, adopt to feel more connected. On the other side of really cultivating a greater sense of comfort with yourself, I think that's often done, in spiritual practices or in contemplative practices. And, there's obviously a lot of, different forms of meditation that are available, or Stoicism was incredibly prominent in my life. It's amazing sort of philosophy of ethics, but there's a lot of contemplations and visualizations associated with Stoicism that I found to be really, really helpful and precipitate a lot of growth for me. So I think that those are the kinds of things that one needs to do to kind of cultivate a greater sense of comfort with one's own self.
I love that. I'd love to spend some time talking about health, diet, fitness, because in the context of delayed gratification, I think one of the hardest things for people when they're trying to transform their health, they're trying to eat less processed foods, they're trying to lose weight, is like they don't know when they're going to reach that end goal. There's no like guaranteed time frame, right? You can have an idea, but there's no guarantee. And sometimes that trips people up and they either just don't start, or they get like a third of the way there, halfway there, and they're like, you know what? It's not happening fast enough. I might as well just quit. What are some of the, I would say, like easy wins in your expertise that people can do to improve their overall health through diet and exercise?
Yeah. Well, I think some of them are potentially obvious and just kind of majoring in the majors, right? So, I'll try to eliminate ultra processed foods for me because I was diabetic. So for me, it was, really eliminating refined sugars, refined grains, and starches. So really, really focusing on the core elements of metabolism. So I wear, continuous glucose monitor on my triceps. Not everybody can do that or afford that. But for me, resetting my core metabolism with minimizing naked, cheap carbs was huge. And that in combination with a 16-8 protocol was a big springboard for me. I lost 65 pounds and basically completely reversed my diabetes. Now, I will say that for me, I used to think about that as a goal, but what I learned is there is no terminus. There is no end product. It is just a process all of the time. The body is nothing but change. We're 37 billion chemical reactions per second. And you have a lot of agency over the trajectory of those chemical reactions. They can either be moving towards wholeness, the process of healing, or moving towards disease, the process of ailing. And you have agency over your behaviors and environment, not complete agency, but you have a good deal of agency. And so, I didn't get hung up on like, oh, I want to weigh 165 and I want to have, this level of muscle mass or whatever. It's more like day to day, I just want to feel great. And, these are the things that I want to, adopt into my life, in order to feel great, as good as I possibly can day to day. So I would say, for me, on the exercise front, I always ask myself this core question. It's like, how did I evolve? So I evolved walking a lot. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors walked, 10 to 15 miles a day. Maybe that's not possible for everybody, but there's never a day that goes by where I don't get 10,000 steps in one way or another, and oftentimes much more than that. So a lot of zone 2, walking, and then lifting heavy things. I mean, lifting heavy things at least 2 to 3 times a week. I'd probably do it more, but I just say the baseline for people, because again, how did you evolve? You evolved walking and building structures and climbing trees and gathering firewood. And so I think that, muscle hypertrophy, especially when you're my age, I'm 54, but, I think you're younger than I am, but starting, at any age, but really in your 40s, I would say resistance training is an absolute must, because you're going to lose 1% of muscle mass every year on average. And it's going to become a little harder to build and maintain muscle mass over the years. So you want your health span to be as good as it possibly can be in your 70s and 80s. And that starts kind of when you're 40s and 50s. And so I think, finding your resistance training protocol that trains all muscles 2 to 3 times a week is huge. And for me, it's more body weight exercises. I'm like 100 pull-ups, 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats a day. That's kind of like my thing. Sometimes I'll miss a few days here and there, but those were my key go-tos, because I can kind of do that anywhere, when I'm on the road. And that made a huge, huge difference in my life, just in so many different ways. More muscle mass it's going to be more metabolically active tissue. And so for my blood glucose regulation, which was my big issue, having more muscle mass was key, because muscle is just a big old glucose vacuum. It's a glucose sink. And your poor old little pancreas doesn't even need to produce insulin for the muscles to uptake glucose. And so that was huge, So I would just say, listen, cut out all the processed foods, cut down on refined sugars and grains, walk like crazy, and lift heavy things. Just those basic things will get you so far down the line. And, Doug, I think we're so used to associating health with downward spirals, but upward spirals are absolutely possible. And it is amazing to see what your body can do and how deeply programmed it is to heal. I mean, just even really after a month, when I hit my nadir in like 2019, early 2020, where I was like 210 pounds and had all of these metabolic issues and chronic levels of high inflammation, it took me really just a couple of months to start to see my life turn around. And in 4 to 6 months, like a new human. You couldn't even recognize me. People were like, what happened to you? Like in a good way. My wife was like, whoa, you look like you're, 25 again. So it's totally possible.
Yeah. And I think, like I said before, people get overwhelmed with the thought of overhauling their life. I mean, I know you mentioned you lost a bunch of weight and that you completely transformed yourself. And I think that while it's important for people to get to a place where they make that change if they need to, the challenge arises that it doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes when you're changing something like your nutrition, it can be tough to get like certain vitamins and minerals and stuff in, and making sure that you're kind of like checking all the boxes when it comes to diet with that. And people will often turn to supplements to kind of aid in that. Curious, like, what are your thoughts on supplements, and like why are certain, like, I know that we're both big fans of Live On Labs and the way that they construct their supplements and with how they stand behind their brand and how effective theirs are. Like, what's the difference? Like, I would love to hear like your thoughts on supplements and why companies like Live On Labs are so effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I was really getting serious about my health, all my functional medicine friends were like, before you really do anything, go test. Like, figure out where you have deficiencies, and so I did, and I had a ton of different deficiencies. I was deficient in magnesium. I was deficient in vitamin D. I was deficient in vitamin C even. So, and you have to really kind of look at these things and try to understand them. I mean, strangely, unlike other animals, we don't actually create vitamin C endogenously. We actually have to get it from diet or supplementation. And so, when I started to supplement with vitamin C initially, and I was kind of off the rack, I was like, okay. And then I'd go in and get testing, and I wasn't really moving the needle. And then, of course, I had to actually learn about the efficient delivery of key nutrients. And a lot of these more kind of traditional supplements, really, they don't become bioavailable because we have these incredible enzymes and hydrochloric acid right in our stomach. And that's very, very useful for breaking down foods and for killing off bacteria and pathogens. But it will also really degrade the efficiency of a lot of normal supplements in the form of kind of pills, et cetera. So then I discovered, this whole concept of liposomal supplementation, which Live On really was kind of the, early to that game. I think they started doing it really in the early aughts, or maybe 2004, where essentially they started to packet these nutrients like magnesium and then like an antioxidant like glutathione, but like vitamin C, inside what are called liposomes, which are these little phospholipid spheres that essentially protect from the degradation that might otherwise be caused through enzyme and stomach acids. And they absorb right into the bloodstream. And because our cell membranes are made of phospholipids, it allows for these nutrients to get absorbed kind of through that envelope right into the cell for maximum efficiency. And then obviously something like magnesium is going to be so massive because it's involved with 300 different enzymatic reactions in the body and has so much to do with so many different systems, particularly metabolism. So, once I discovered the benefits and attributes of this kind of lipospheric delivery method, I became a total convert to the Live On products. And, the glutathione, the vitamin C, the magnesium, kind of in particular, but I find them to be really highly effective. And then also I don't have any digestive issues with them. A lot of people find, have a little bit of discomfort, but because they're packaged in that phospholipid, they really minimize any kind of digestive tract discomfort. So I think it's Live On for the win. And, my wife sucks it right out of the pack. So
Really?
Yeah. So she's got all of our girls, we're all doing that. We just suck them right out of the pack.
Yeah. I mean, I've been using their products off and on for the last, going on almost 5 years. Been a big fan of the brand and what they've been doing for a while. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely important for people to do their research and their own due diligence when it comes to the supplements that they're taking. And I know Live On puts a lot of work into research into each product that they release. And it's interesting too, because they don't sell everything. I think they just sell the basics and the ones that they believe are going to give you the most bang for the buck. In the context of stress and what we're talking about here, I love the magnesium, obviously, for stress, vitamin C, B complex. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on your favorite supplements when it comes to managing stress.
Yeah. Well, certainly magnesium. I think that there's a lot of data there in terms of magnesium as an electrolyte, right, to minimize stress. Yeah, I also take some things not in their non-liposomal form, like berberine is actually one that I take, which is really kind of a natural supplement geared towards blood glucose management. That's still sort of an area that I need to focus on. And, if I'm even slightly off my game, I do see significant rises in blood glucose. And when that starts to happen for me, because I was so insulin resistant, then I start to see my lipid panels get a little bit wonky because that's all connected. I've been taking some fairly high quality berberine products. I also take a pepper extract, kind of turmeric extract, pepper activated, which is a good product. And, I have kind of a green powder that my wife assembles, which is like how I end my day with this sort of swamp-like gruel of pulverized grasses and nettles and spirulina and chlorella. She mixes that up with some collagen and some creatine and kind of puts it just into some lukewarm water. And that's like my morning penance for any vice that I committed the night before. I have to pay that price. But, I think that, listen, our food system has really contributed to the degradation of a lot of nutrients in our food, even in our whole foods. And, our soils have been sapped of a lot of nutrients, and by extension, the plants that we eat or the animals that eat the plants that we eat or the plants that are grown don't have the same level of nutritional value. And this is why I think supplementation can be very important for people. And like I say, the best way to find out is to test. Go in, there's your PCP. I mean, yeah, you can get like fancy blood panel work done through Function Health, et cetera, where you can get 100 biomarkers on your phone. But even your normal family doctor, your PCP, they will run tests. You just need to ask. And most of the time, they will run most of these tests, and you can see where you're deficient, and then you can make intelligent, informed choices about your own supplementation routine based upon those results.
And I think that it is important for people to kind of look at it in a very holistic approach, like we've talked about, and making sure that they're covering all the bases, that they're looking at the way they manage stress. They're looking at the way that they implement variations of good stress into their life so that they can become more resilient. You create some sort of social fitness program so that you're not falling into the trap of loneliness, which is so easy to do given the world that we live in. You're taking care of your overall mental and physical well-being, and then, looking at your diet, and then whatever doesn't match up and wherever you're kind of trying to fill in a gap, that's where supplementation comes in. What are I guess as we're kind of bringing this to a close, just to kind of close the loop on Live On and their supplements, you mentioned magnesium. Any others that you think that the listeners should check out when it comes to helping them maybe fill in the gaps when it comes to things that can help with things like stress and overall diet?
Yeah, again, like for me, I think it's like my daily there is the B complex. I mean, really, especially if my diet tends to be slightly more plant focused. So I think that's a place that's important. The vitamin C, really, yeah, for some of the immune benefits, but really as an antioxidant, which, doesn't really get much conversation of vitamin C as an antioxidant, but it is a really, really powerful antioxidant. The magnesium and the glutathione, and kind of that quartet is kind of it's sort of what I would call my four horsemen, I guess, that gallop into my life on a regular basis. And then, yeah, I mean, for me, like diet is really key, and when I eat is really key. I find that when I'm pretty disciplined on, finishing, basically putting the last bite of food in my mouth, 3 to 3.5 hours before I go to sleep, I almost always sleep better, and I'm going to sleep in a more fully digested phase. And, my body then has more energy for kind of the repair process that happens at night. And, sleep, it's not very sexy, but it's so foundational to managing stress. I mean, and yeah, we know that hormonally, we can examine the crests and troughs of cortisol and melatonin, et cetera. But we also know that just by dint of what it's like to be alive, if we're exhausted in the morning and the only way that we can kind of get into the day is by slamming espresso and then having like a huge crash, and then, we just don't make good decisions, when we don't have that foundational sleep. We tend to be, more cranky, more triggerable, more agitated. Our ability to focus and concentrate seems to be impeded. So, really gearing your diet and supplementation regimen for sleep, I think can be really, really beneficial. And that might be like when you supplement. Like I tend to supplement with, magnesium actually in the evening and not in the morning. So that's something that people might want to consider.
Yeah, the four that I take the most are vitamin C, the B complex, magnesium, and glutathione. And I definitely recommend people go and check out Live On Labs. Live On Labs is doing this really cool thing where if you click the link in the description below, you can actually get a free carton of the B complex that we've been talking about as long as you purchase something else. So all you have to do is purchase one of their other supplements, add the B complex, click the link below or enter in the code BOPST24, that's BOPST 24 at checkout to get the free carton of B complex. So it's really cool they're doing that. And hopefully I'll check it out because I love their products and they make great stuff.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.